Okay, here we have the definition of average rate of change. And here we have a problem. It says find the average rate of change of y with respect to x for f of x equals 2 to the x minus 3 on the interval -1 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 2, right? So we compare this with the definition and we see that, well, here's f of x, and we've mentioned f of x, right? So that this definition applies to this situation. And the other thing we need to see is our interval is from -1 to 2. So A is -1 and B is 2, right? So what does this tell us to do? It tells us to find the points A, f of A, and B, f of B. It actually doesn't tell us to find these points. It tells us the fundamental triangle for these points, but we're not going to be able to do that fundamental triangle unless we got this point and this point, right? So we find these points. So we first identify so the point A, f of A, is the point -1, f of -1. So what is f of -1? Here's f of x. What's f of -1? Well, 2 to the -1 is what?
1 over 2 to the first.
The only way you know that 2 to the -1 is 1/2 by making a table for 2 to the x. You need to understand what we mean by 2 to the -1, right? And we know what that is. It's 1 over 2 to the 1, which is 1/2. What's 1/2 minus 3?
-2.5.
Well, I'll leave it to your arithmetic to reconcile this, but I believe it's -5/2, okay? Then the point B, f of B, is 2, and 2 to the x would be 2 f of 2. Well, we'll write that out. Okay? Well, f of 2 is what? 2 to the second minus 3, which is 4 minus 3, which is 1, right? Okay? Now I can easily now say, etc. Because all you have to do now is what?
Find the slope.
Yeah, well, you probably want to draw a graph,
Yeah.
sketch the fundamental triangle, right? But I'll go ahead and do the etc. just because it's the first time we've seen this, and we want to make sure that we understand. Well, the etc. Okay, here's the etc. A graph of this function, well, it's a graph of 2 to the x lowered 3 units, isn't it? So we can incorporate what we understand about that. Here's our graph of 2 to the x. We lower it 3 units, and we get our graph of this thing, and I want to make sure everything makes some kind of sense. So yeah, okay, 3.5 would be about there. And, no, sorry, that's at -1, it'd be about there. And then we're going to be about here. So we lowered 3 units, right? 3 units down for every point. Now, understanding that, we sketch our fundamental triangle and label it, and we're done. Okay? So every step here is something you've done. I've had you do things like A, f of A for a function, right? Okay? Giving you values of A and B. And of course, we've done plenty of graph sketching. So right there's our fundamental triangle, but we need to label it, meaning that we label the coordinates of the points, which is -1, -5/2, 2, 1. And then we put an arrow on there somewhere to indicate our positive direction. So if we go from -5/2, from -1 to 1, our run is, we're going from -1 to 2, our run is 3, right? So we know how to do this. Our run is 3. From -5/2 up to 1, the rise is 7/2. So the slope will be what? Well, rise divided by run is 7/2 divided by 3, right? And that's 7/6, and if you have to review fractions, get on the web and do it. Okay? So our slope will be 7/6. Now, the problem never asked us to completely label the triangle. If it did, we would have to put our hypotenuse in here too, right? But I'm just using the triangle, and I know that the average rate of change is just the slope of the stupid triangle. Okay? So it becomes a very simple process. We evaluate the function at the endpoints of the interval to get 2 points. Construct a fundamental triangle, preferably on the graph of the function, so you can kind of see what it's telling you about the function. Not absolutely necessary to do that, but since you're going to this trouble, you ought to practice graphing the function, right? Okay? And then we draw the triangle, figure out the slope, and there's our average rate of change.